Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Responding to Trauma Tuesday, the Impact of Trauma and How to Become Resilient. It is being presented by the National Apartment Association's Mental Health Subcommittee. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA. I want to welcome all of our members in attendance. Thank you for joining us for this important topic. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this presentation with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Second, we have a lot of time at the end for live questions and answers. You may type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen, and we will read them aloud and answer them aloud. Now I am pleased to introduce our presenter. Next slide, please. Dr. Laura Leone is a consultant with the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. She brings over 20 years of experience in mental health and substance abuse services to her role. Laura has published and presented nationally, having held leadership, clinical, administrative, supervisory, research, and publication positions at a variety of hospitals and healthcare facilities. She obtained her DSW in social work from the University of Southern California, plus an MS in social work from Columbia University. Welcome, Laura.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here for today's presentation on the impact of trauma and how to become resilient. You're responding to Trauma Tuesday. Before we begin, I really like to start the tone by helping us to all refocus and really come to today's presentation. And I want to thank you for being here because you are all here as learners on sort of three levels. You're here learning as individuals for yourselves, maybe for your family, your friends. You're here learning on behalf of your organizations and the work that you do. And you're here learning on behalf of your residents and the staff that you interact and work with, your colleagues. So it's very much appreciated that you're taking the time to be here to watch this presentation. So I just want to invite us to, as we're getting through the day and all sorts of things are always constantly happening, different distractions come in and out. I really want to invite you to try to turn away from those distractions as best you can and help to connect and be focused and present for the presentation. And I really do enjoy using different kinds of relaxation techniques, or in this case, a mindfulness technique to just refocus. And I might do this even periodically throughout my own workday as I go through the day-to-day activities that pull us in the many directions. So first, I want to invite you to be comfortable in your seat, your chair, wherever you are. Feel your feet on the floor, feel yourselves in the chair, kind of thinking about just being in a balanced position. And then let's go ahead and focus in on our breath. So as best you can, if you can slowly breathe in through the nose and letting it out slowly through the mouth. And really pay attention to breathing in deeply and pulling that in so that your belly, as you're breathing in, expands out like a balloon, like you're filling up a balloon. And then as you breathe out, feeling your belly deflate back in, just like letting the air out of a balloon. And go ahead and continue to breathe in and out slowly. And as I mentioned, as a mindfulness strategy, one thing we can do is to become color aware. So please take a moment to just gaze into this picture that you see here on the screen. Really allow the colors to become conscious to you. Allow yourself to become aware of all of the amazing and different tones, shades, and hues of just one color, green. Take that in. Notice all the variations, the details. And notice the different objects that you see, the different shapes, sizes, textures of the leaves, the trees and the bushes. Just immerse yourself in that scene. Continue to breathe. And now just please turn your focus to whatever emotions might be present for you right now. They could be positive emotions, they may be negative, or perhaps you're feeling a little bit numb, or you're not sure how you're feeling. But whatever you find, just regard that as being where you are right now in the moment. Finally, take one more good deep breath in. Slowly let it out. And welcome again to the presentation. So today's presentation is going to cover many different things. We have a lot to cover and get into. We're going to give an overview of the prevalence, the impact, and the science of trauma, talking about some of the ins and outs and details of trauma and the trauma experience. We're going to talk through the connection between behavior and trauma and understanding that adverse events, traumatic events, really coats and gives a lens to the way in which we perceive the world and the way in which the world perceives us. We'll talk further and get into what is being trauma informed and resilience oriented. What does that mean? As well as, what are some techniques, some things we can do to use with those that we serve, the residents that you're connecting with, the staff that you have. Being able to look at different skills. We'll talk about some de-escalation and dive in a little bit deeper there. And then, of course, also other strategies that we can use for ourselves and again, for our staff when we think about just burnout and compassion fatigue and how instead we really want to have compassion resilience through self-care. So we'll explore all of that today. Again, I do want to invite you, just as James did, to feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box or put any information in the chat that you would like me to cover or to address when we have the Q&A period. So first, what is trauma? So according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma has three key components. It is an event or a set of circumstances that can occur, and it's experienced either directly or indirectly as overwhelming or life-changing. And we know for sure that there's profound effects on a person's individual well-being or a system's individual well-being or a community's individual well-being and psychological development. And that certainly there's a social and spiritual impact that can occur. This is, there's many different types of trauma and trauma adjacent things that we need to keep in mind. So some terms that you might have heard or that you will hear me say could be about childhood adversity. So this might be a wide range of circumstances or events that pose a serious threat to a child's physical or psychological well-being. Adverse childhood experiences. This is sort of a subset of childhood adversities that include information that was gleaned in what we call the ACEs study. So ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And I'll talk a little bit further about the ACEs study in a little bit. And then, of course, trauma, right? So possible outcome of exposure to adversity that occurs when a person perceives an event or set of circumstances as extremely frightening, harmful, or threatening. And then there's toxic stress. So this can occur when an individual experiences adversity that is extreme, it's long lasting and severe without adequate support, and that stress response system becomes overactivated. So again, we're going to kind of cover all of these areas. We know that there's all sorts of types of trauma that exist. So there's child maltreatment and complex trauma. There are medical traumas. Serious accidents or illnesses are considered traumatic. Natural disasters, war, terrorism, political violence, being a victim or witness to interpersonal or domestic violence, any community and school violence, traumatic grief or separation, any sort of significant loss, aging, chronic health conditions, pandemics, as we have all been experiencing together, and these are just some of the categories of trauma. However, trauma, much like crisis, is subjective. If someone experiences something as traumatic, then it is traumatic, whether you or anyone else views it the same or not. And just something to keep in mind as that perception of what can be traumatic or not. Just the same way something that we might perceive as traumatic, somebody might experience and go through and manage it in a different way. The other types of trauma that we have are historical and generational trauma as well. So, this can include, cumulative and emotional psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group traumatic experiences. So genocide, slavery, pandemics, massacres, prohibition, destruction of cultural practices, discrimination, or systemic prejudice, and forced relocation all kind of fall under this category. And we learned a lot about traumatic experiences or adverse experiences, as I mentioned, from the ACEs study. So this study occurred first in the mid-1990s. It was the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, along with Kaiser Permanente, who partnered to do a study where they screened over 17,000 adults, mostly middle-class, college-educated, and employed Caucasians. And they looked at 10 adverse childhood experiences, experiences that occurred before the age of 18, what we call ACEs. And they looked to see if there was a correlation between these childhood experiences and then the negative health outcomes that they were seeing in their population. And what they found is that almost 67% of the individuals, more than half, had experienced at least one ACE before the age of 18, and over 20% had experienced 3 or more ACEs before the age of 18. So ACEs, again, included the initial 10 areas that were looked at were child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, childhood emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, living with someone with a mental health challenge, such as a depressed person or somebody experiencing suicide in the home, living with somebody with substance use in the home, witnessing any sort of interpersonal domestic violence in the home, loss of a parent or significant caregiver due to death, abandonment, which included abandonment by divorce, or any incarceration of a family member. And over time, this particular study, they found that almost 2/3, again, of the participants reported at least one ACE, and 1/5 reported 3 or more ACEs, and that there were major links identified between early childhood trauma and long-term health outcomes, which I'll show you in a minute. Since this initial study, it has been replicated, so done over and over again with other populations of people in all sorts of different communities over and over again to really solidify our knowledge of what really ACEs in those adverse childhood experiences can do, what the impact of them are. So really thinking through sort of those outcomes, here you see on the slide all sorts of connections to things like diabetes, to lung cancer, to suicide attempts, skeletal fractures. All of these things have been directly correlated to experiences with having one or more ACEs. The more ACEs that somebody has before the age of 18, the more likely they are to experience some of these things. And that's what this slide here shows you, that you might be 12.2 times more likely to have a suicide attempt based on each sort of increase, each ACE that you have. So really there's an opportunity here in what we do to intervene, what we do to provide prevention. And certainly if somebody has experienced an adverse childhood experience, a trauma, that the closer to that point that we can help in providing treatment, intervention, and processing around that, the better that person can be and the less likely they are to have those sort of negative health outcomes. With children of parents with ACEs scores that have 4 or more, they're 6.3 times more likely to experience a household substance abuse or just use in general. They're 10.4 times more likely to experience homelessness, and so on. We see the effect on children. They're three times more likely to fail school. They're 6 times more likely to have a severe behavior problem. They're 3 times more likely to repeat a grade. So there's all sorts of, again, opportunities to intervene when we think about the children in our lives and just the experiences that people have had growing up. So useful to know for children as well as for the adults and what they may have experienced in the past. We also know, in connection to trauma, that there is a cyclical effect between trauma and substance use. That trauma is a risk factor for substance use is a risk factor for trauma. So individuals who are already, using substances may be less able to cope with a traumatic event, and as a result, of that functional impairment associated with problematic use. And it's just thinking through and understanding that there is that pattern that exists there, and recognizing that sometimes when we're seeing certain substance use in residents, or what we know of just people in our lives, that there is often a connection to trauma or an adverse experience, whether it happened before or after the age of 18. And some of the reasons, we could go on, to kind of look at this, right, for reasons for substance use. But a lot of these things, again, are connected to trauma in that sort of lens, right? So staying safe, trauma can feel like a danger zone, which makes being out of it to some extent, or disconnected, or having a break, feel safer than being in it, right? And so escaping memories and unwanted and unresolved memories have a way of popping up and incessantly, especially incessantly after trauma. Thinking about, addiction offers sort of a mind a different area or reduced capacity for focus that helps suppress that reminiscing. For soothing pain, substances or the adrenaline rush of self-destructive behaviors can change body chemistry, releasing endorphins and other mood enhancers that reduce discomfort. Being in control, which is again another potential reason for substance use. Sometimes engaging in addictive behaviors can lead to feeling strong, resilient, and courageous. An experience that is tremendously alluring when trauma from the past intrudes on the present. Creating a tolerable world. So the intense feelings brought on by fear, memories, and anxiety can make any moment seem overwhelming. And so the release of tension brought on by addiction-oriented behavior can help facilitate a manageable experience. Creating alignment. So trauma can leave you feeling less than, or worthless, hopeless, damaged. The more self-destructive one behaves, the more it can feel like they're living in alignment with who they truly are. And while this is false, it can help reduce feeling of otherness or disconnection. And sort of last, but certainly not least, redefining oneself. So engaging in addictions can help create a sense of community by connecting to others who feel, see, think, and behave the same. Or addictions can help by allowing one to engage in or act out behaviors that allow one to feel stronger, more courageous, capable, etc. And, all of these are not to sort of justify or kind of make a judgment call here on the choice to use substances or not, but to really put it again into context of how it may be connected to somebody's life experiences and traumatic experiences, and things can really fall through a slippery slope. And for many different reasons, as I just kind of talked about, there can be, that rationale to dull the pain or to feel something different, or to just, have connections between a social outlet that, again, can kind of cause other problems that certainly affect the residents that you all work with. So, keeping all of this information about trauma in mind and sort of what it is, this is where we want to lean into having a trauma informed approach. So, it's how can all of us, help? What does it mean to be trauma informed? So, and I like to really start out by saying the terminology of trauma informed to some extent is a repackaging of terminology for things that we already know work really well and that we should be doing. Things like respecting one another, good customer service, those things, that's being trauma informed. Having physical environments that are well kept, that are safe, inviting, comforting, that's being trauma informed. Right. So, really thinking about these sort of four key elements that you see here on the screen, that being trauma informed means we understand and realize that there's this prevalence of trauma, right? That even before the age of 18, more than half of us have at least experienced one of those adverse childhood experiences that I listed earlier. Never mind what kind of occurs 18 and older, the things that we have all experienced. And we know that we all have at least one experience having gone through and still are going through the COVID-19 pandemic. Right. The second piece here, the second key element is about recognizing how trauma affects individuals involved, whether that's involved, in the program or in a system or, in this case, in an apartment building, in the staff. And we'll talk a little bit further today about just sort of some of those effects and the behaviors that we see. We also want to help people to resist re-traumatizing others, right? So understanding that traumas can happen, can occur. We know to some extent we can just assume that more than half of all people have experienced at least one trauma. We also then can assume that there is that potential for re-traumatization that we want to reduce and mitigate the risk for. And of course, this means responding to all of this knowledge by putting it into practice, making it into procedures, practices, settings. So a program or an organization or a system that is trauma informed realizes this widespread impact of trauma, understands potential paths for healing, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in staff, in residents, and others involved in the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, practices, procedures, and settings. So, understanding, part of the shift is also not only having that blanket sort of understanding of those four key elements and just having sort of a universal understanding that let's just assume that most, if not all of the people that we interact with are probably going to have some experience of trauma. We also want to think about how it shifts from a model that asks, what's wrong with you, to instead one that asks, what happened to you? Tell me your story. Let me understand. Let me be considerate of your history, your experiences in life. And how do we really shift the environment and the practices to respond more effectively to your needs? For me, as we kind of start to think through, different behavior, and we'll talk about sort of the impact of trauma. And when I'm not sort of understanding how somebody is acting or what they might be saying or doing, taking a step back and recognizing or thinking about the possible experiences that this person has had, the traumatic experiences, the adverse events, helps me to frame how I might interact a little bit differently or how I might respond differently. Being trauma informed really includes these 6 areas that you see here on the screen. The first area is really kind of primal and sort of initial for really being able to move on to the other areas. And that's the area of safety. And safety comes in all different types. So sort of most immediately people think of safety, they think of physical safety, just of somebody's kind of personal well-being in their environment. But safety is more than that. It's emotional or psychological safety, right? Like understanding and being okay with oneself, feeling internally like that they're doing all right, that they are okay to kind of proceed. There's social safety. So feeling okay in and among other people. So not yourself, sort of that internal process, but the sort of external connection to other people and, again, person and environment, making sure that things are okay and attuned. And then there's moral safety. And this is really a safety around being true to your own personal morals and values and beliefs, and that's not thwarted or sort of pushed against by other varying forces. So having sort of the all four levels of safety allows us to really be able to move on to some of these other concepts like trustworthiness and transparency. And as I move through these things, like they, to some extent, they're just things, again, that we know that make sense, that are good to be, good to do, and packaged together really can represent being trauma informed. So being trustworthy, forthcoming, and transparent, right? This is not Wizard of Oz. There's no man behind the curtain. Being as open as we can be in any sort of process and any sort of communication, we know helps build those connections and that comfort level for people. Having peer support, being able to really value lived experience, no matter what that experience is related to, and to have someone to connect with that, that's relatable. So thinking through sort of in any kind of category, whether it's about trauma, whether it's about just another sort of experience in life, being able to have somebody else who's been through that to help maybe provide guidance or hope, that helps to be sort of trauma informed. Collaboration and mutuality. We partner with one another. We shouldn't be doing things to people or at them. It should be with them. So really, how do we do that? Again, for our staff or for our residents, for ourselves. And an important thing to remember here is being trauma informed. We do this sort of we can be this way in sort of any industry, in any way that we're connecting. So whether it's somebody, again, in the sort of apartment and housing industry, whether this is somebody in like some other corporation or a healthcare agency, it doesn't really matter sort of where we can be trauma informed in all these sort of settings, school systems, and so on. That collaboration and mutuality of really partnering and hearing each other and listening to one another. And this leans into this empowerment, voice, and choice, right? People want to have a sense that they're empowered to do things, that they are equipped, and that people around them are okay with them, again, having a voice, speaking up and making choices, being able, again, not to forcefully try to tell somebody to do something, but to offer them a little bit or a lot of choice in that matter. And that can really go a long way, again, in being trauma informed, which ultimately helps people to be at ease, to calm down, to connect in the world in a different and more positive way. And also, of course, cultural, historical, and gender considerations. Being able to, in anything that we do, we have to understand and recognize that there should never be a one size fits all approach to what we do, that everyone comes with their own personal history, their own cultural beliefs. People are from different communities, different age groups, and we want to always try to keep that in mind. I like the term and use of cultural humility versus being culturally competent. When I think of competence, right, like having to know everything there is to know or do everything there is to do, that's a lot to take on. And it's just fairly impossible to kind of know everything all the time. But if we approach life with cultural humility, which is really about recognizing that we're not going to know everything, but having an openness to learn and to ask and be inquisitive and to be opening to hear and having people share that information, then we are primed and ready for being in really approaching and what is necessary sort of in this principle. So, we really know, as we think about, shifting of what sort of how trauma impacts others, and sort of the lens at which people might see the world through, you know, it's this sort of lens, right, of we see things as we are, not as the things that they are. That if we've experienced trauma in our own lives, like we have that sort of lens over sort of the view of what we're looking at, and we have to remember that of other people as well, that everyone kind of comes with their different perspectives. So it's important to understand the ways in which trauma impacts us on different levels. So the lens in which we look at and interpret the world can be different, and trauma shapes our beliefs. It impacts the way we view our world, our spirituality, and ourselves. It creates a feeling of being unworthy. It can create a feeling of being unsafe, of intense fear, and the need for power and control. So, you know, in typical development, you know, without trauma, we might think, all right, I live in a predictable and benevolent world. But with that lens of trauma that might occur, that developmental trauma, that sometimes can be shifted to people want to hurt me. And sort of, and these are not always sort of conscious or aware thoughts, but sort of this undercurrent subconscious kind of viewpoints that we will have because of the trauma. We might see things as I'm not safe, or I am afraid. Typical development, we might see, or we might think I am worthwhile. But with developmental trauma, we might think no one will help me, or I am not good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough for people to care about me. Typical trauma, we might think I'm hopeful, optimistic about my future. Whereas, typical development, I said, we would feel that way. And then with developmental trauma, that gets shifted to, you know, it will never get better. And with typical development, I have the ability to impact and change my life. We might feel that way, but with a trauma lens, that developmental trauma that can occur, then there sometimes is this need to establish personal power and control, to feel like you have control over something, because things feel out of control or chaotic. There's a lot of things that sort of sit in the room with trauma. You know, these are all the kinds of seen and unseen burdens people feel when they have been traumatized. And, you know, I would contend that even the worst behaved person is trying very hard not to show what is just underneath the surface. And sometimes they can do that, and then sometimes they cannot, no matter how hard they try. And when you all think about those sort of problems that you might occur in the work that you're doing, with the residents you're working with, or the people you're connected to, you know, when you think about some of those examples, my guess is a lot of those examples have to do with things you might see here on the screen: feeling defiance, anger, disruptive mood, maybe some sort of dissociation or disconnection, mistrust, inattention, the need to control, right? All of these things and more. This is not an exhaustive list, you know, can occur because of that trauma lens. And some responses that we might see sort of in the moment could be sort of a physical response, right? These are all the things that kind of can occur to our bodies as a result of the trauma, and what might happen, you know, in our bodies. You know, there's emotional, there's changes in sleep patterns, there's changes in the way that we eat. Again, how we feel about things: anxiety, depression, moods, other mood swings, fears, or phobias that can occur. Heart palpitations, sweating, dizziness, and more. You know, we might have this, you know, feelings sort of become more intense and sometimes more unpredictable. There's different kind of shifts in thinking patterns, the way that we have and relate to other people. Those interpersonal relationships might be shifted and changed. So, you know, what sort of becomes typical is all adjusted and all shifted because of the experiences that we have. And this is sort of regardless of whether that experience, that trauma, that adverse event just happened or whether it happened years ago. There still can be lasting impacts, and certainly will be if that doesn't get addressed, if it doesn't get acknowledged and sort of processed. So, there's sort of things that can also trigger or remind us about trauma, whether that's sort of, anything having to do with the five senses of smell, sight, sound, touch, and taste. And then we also can have sort of internal reminders of the traumatic event. So things about emotions, certain emotions that we might have might bring us back to that place. They might bring us back to that event, or certain thoughts that we might have. Triggers can actually be positive or negative. Apple pie cooking, the smell of turkey at Thanksgiving, right? Those burning leaves in the fall. Maybe those are some positive sort of triggers that remind us of good stuff. Fresh rain smell, or the flowers in the spring. And smell is strongest as the olfactory system, right? The smell system is right next to our amygdala, which is connected to, again, our sort of thoughts and our feelings. But when triggers are paired with negative emotions, they become negative triggers that will be connected to that negative emotion. So the body will feel all the sensations that were felt at the time of the event connected to the trigger. So as an example, the smell of a certain flower can be positive. However, when it's smelled at a funeral of someone you love, that feelings of grief can become associated with the smell of the flowers, and thus it becomes a negative trigger for you. That's why you might meet a lot of people who don't really love the smell of lilies, because lilies are a common flower at many wakes and funerals, as an example, and can be associated again with the death of a loved one. So we don't really know what kinds of triggers are going to be there for others. Unfortunately, it's not possible to know all the things that may trigger somebody, but we can assist people in learning what their triggers are and developing strategies for working with them. Or just for our own knowledge, we can think about any triggers for ourselves, and kind of understanding that and figuring out what we need to do for ourselves to be aware of just how to manage when a trigger might occur, a negative trigger might occur, or sort of avoid some of those negative triggers if possible. And I know we do have a question that came in that I will get to in a little bit, which is really just focused around, what are some ways that we can ways that we can manage when we get triggered? What are some things that we can do for ourselves or for others? And I will get to that in a little bit. The impact of trauma can be physical. This is, we can, we feel it actually in many different pieces of our body. It impacts our hormones. It impacts just the general functioning of our body, our nervous system, our immune system. It actually impacts the architecture of our brain. Our cells get inflamed. There's actually an inflammation that occurs. There's adrenaline and cortisol that's pumping through the body. And all of this is happening because of our sort of way that we're programmed in our bodies for the survival mode response. And I don't know if those of you who might have covered this in sort of like high school biology, right? It's this fight, flight, or freeze response mode that happens due to stress. And we can think about it as stress. We can think about it as an adverse event, a traumatic event, right? We feel stress, and it sort of happens increased. And this is the same process that happens when we experience chronic stress conditions, where we might be in really stressful work environments or lifestyles that, and we know we're always feeling a sort of a heightened level of stress. And over time, our bodies react in just the same way. But when a traumatic event happens, we innately either fight, flight, or freeze. So if you think about, like, if an accident occurred. Let's say you were in a car accident. When it first happened, what was your immediate response? Did you freeze? Did you want to fight who hit you? Did you want to leave as quickly as possible? Right? All of those above reactions are normal. When we get scared, our body naturally wants to protect us and take over. And so it's one of our survival skills, much like breathing, which we do without thinking. We activate it when we believe there's a chance when we can outrun or outfight our attackers. The freeze response, however, gets activated when there's no hope. In some respects, this response, whatever you call it, could be seen as an energy conservation device. It allowed our prehistoric ancestors to go through their day using a modest amount of energy for mundane tasks while keeping a massive amount of energy always on reserve in case of an emergency. And our bodies through evolution has held on to this kind of process. So if while engaged in completing these mundane tasks, a predator were to jump out of the bushes, our ancestors would be able to, in a split second, dramatically increase their physical resources, instantly fight harder or run faster than they ever had in their whole lives. And this response was very adaptive because it allowed our ancestors to change gears literally in the span of a single heartbeat. And we can still do this today and call up this tremendous strength, right? Like you've heard about the stories about the woman who lifted her car off of her son, right? This is not an urban legend. This is legitimately something that, when we have that huge adrenaline and cortisol rush, that we've become sort of evolutionarily prepared to potentially do at any time we need to. And also that our bodies can turn it off when the danger passes. The freeze response, again, works differently. While when we're overwhelmed by an attacker and we perceive that there's sort of no hope of surviving, we tend to freeze. And we call this the response that I just talked about a moment ago is sort of our hyper arousal response. And this is sort of our hypo arousal response. We shut down, we dissociate, we disconnect. And to really think about, just what sort of happens in our body. And this gets activated. And with a traumatic event, this kind of stays within us for longer periods of time. So we don't sort of come down from it in the same way that we would after we were attacked by a nearby panther that came through. We wouldn't, we would have, we would experience that attack, we would run away, we would do stuff, and then we would come down from it. Sort of a trauma experience has a lasting attack. It's like the panther is with us the entire time and just hanging out with us. And so we're in that state for much longer periods of time. And this has all sorts of negative impacts on our body's system and the way in which we can function in how we handle the world around us. So stress on the brain in this survival mode response has a huge impact on how we function and how we think about things. We have an inability to respond, to learn, and to process information. And this is because sort of with that conservation that I talked about of the body, part of it is the conservation of our brain mechanisms. It actually sort of shuts down some of the processes that happen in the brain and brings it all down to our sort of basic survival response, where everything shuts down besides that primal response mode. And that happens sort of in the back of our brain, in the brain stem, this sort of lower brain that is responsible for that fight, flight, and freeze mode. And so if you've ever heard, like, in a crisis or in a scary event, like, don't make any major life changes or decisions, right? It actually comes from this, because we don't think, respond, learn, and process the same way we do in those heightened levels of stress and trauma or crisis that we would when we're not feeling that way. So again, whether we're sort of in that hyper arousal state of like really being stressed and can't relax, versus the hypo arousal state and response of freezing or shut down, both are completely natural and natural ways for our bodies to respond as survival. But we have to kind of recognize that in those moments, we can't sort of do these other pieces that respond, learn, and process. And again, when we're working and interacting with a resident, with somebody who is really triggered, they're in this sort of hypoarousal state, and we're trying to process, information with them, or reason or rationalize something, that person might not be really fully understanding or really grasping that situation, because they may have experienced a trauma that kind of puts them in this state where they're not really, again, responding, learning, or processing the same way they would if they weren't. So sort of another way to think about this sort of brain experience is this slide that you see here, which is brain-based science, and it's the Triune brain language. And this is, again, what I'm talking about is that in sort of a leveled approach, if we sort of start from the bottom, the brain stem in microseconds is really sensing what is coming in and out of the body, and just seeing what's happening with the body. And it's constantly asking, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Remember, safety: physical, emotional, psychological, social, moral safety. Am I safe? Over and over and over again. If the brain appraises safety and it says, like, yes, we're good, we're safe, it gives the clear go for sort of the next level up of the brain, which is the limbic system, and that's focuses on emotion and memory. And this area is going to be asking, am I loved? Am I loved? Am I loved? And by loved, I mean to be seen and to be witnessed. Am I being seen? Am I being witnessed? If those are attuned to, then we can move on to sort of the highest level of the brain, the thinking brain. It's sort of the window to providing meaning making, or seeking meaning making. And this level of the brain is asking, what can I learn? What can I learn? And we cannot produce, we cannot work without having these other foundations initially served, right? So, safety and significant relationships, and then on to production. So as we think about ourselves, the people that we're interacting with, our residents, it's thinking about sort of these levels here of the brain that really that function. And as I'm talking, and before I sort of get into other sort of behavioral stuff, I just want to take a pause, to let people know that the content of these slides, I'm happy to share them. And so feel free to put your email in the chat if this is a slide deck that you would like access to. I was hoping to be able to upload that in the chat, but I don't think that feature is turned on. So I do have those slides available if you do want to email me or send me your email. And in fact, I will also go ahead and share my email for everyone as well here, as well as I will put it at the end of, you'll see at the end of the slides. And I know you're all sending your email addresses in now, so thank you. Okay, so here is my email. So you all have that as well. And oh my gosh, so you all want it. Perfect. All right, excellent. So all this information, and there's, again, I'm kind of going through bits and pieces here, right? There's so much more to dig in to, like, what is trauma? What's those impacts? How does it affect? But I want us to really move into thinking about, like, how do we interact with people who are experiencing trauma? What does that look like for de-escalation? Because when I think about just, the possibility of residents that you may be working with that come to you that are agitated or anxious or really upset, or just sort of not handling themselves well, right? People who are experiencing trauma have a hard time managing their emotions and their responses, and they can get angry, they get anxious, they can get agitated more easily. Just the same way they might shut down and turn away more easily. So these are some, strategies that we use for de-escalation techniques. Some of these things, like teach proactive regulation strategies. That's a little bit of a more clinical jargon here, right? Like, different kinds of And basically that really is pertaining to like, how do we calm ourselves? What do we do to relax and calm down? And again, I'm going to get to some of that in a few minutes from now. We want to help people to have, think about thoughtful interactions using first person language, and the language that we use is really important. Fostering safe space, recognizing areas of strength, trying to avoid punitive or exclusionary practices, right? People really can negatively respond to those feelings. Being able to be strengths-based in certain moments where people are really struggling. If we can do things such as recognize a strength or a skill or a positive attribute in a meaningful and authentic way, right? I don't mean just like forcing words out of your mouth, or kind of not being genuine or authentic in saying something, because people can feel that when our authenticity is a little less than, people sense that and they feel that. So you want to be careful not to be disingenuous in any way. But if we can be strengths based, we can recognize a skill and an ability that somebody has. It helps decrease that escalated behavior that somebody might have, that increased agitation and emotion. We also, want to do things, just even think about like your posture, how you stand, the tone of your voice. So when we're responding to escalated behavior, being able to, stay calm. We want to think about the tone of our voice, think about like how that comes across, or you might be you sounding patronizing, is there, can you kind of keep your tone of voice at a lower, more even rate, as somebody escalates their voice, keeping your voice intentionally de-escalated or lowered, is a skill that can often work and help. Having your arms and your body sort of be open and not closed off. So crossing your arms or hands on your hips, really thinking about instead leaving your arms open in a posture that's open and inviting, but being careful of where you're standing, right? Again, depending on how agitated somebody is, safety wise, you might want to not stand directly face to face. You might want to stand actually at an angle to somebody, a little bit perpendicular to them, kind of turning your body, but again, still being really open. You do want to avoid, of course, physical confrontation, and where you need to set some safety limits or boundaries. That's important too, right? Safety first. So when an individual is engaging in unsafe behaviors, you might need to call for help, crisis team or 911 kind of thing. But respecting somebody's personal space and really remembering just that there can be a discomfort. And again, with that lens of understanding people's experiences of trauma, we just don't know what kind of is happening behind the scenes because of what they've been through as an individual, or as a person, as part of a community or group. And so there's a level of compassion and understanding if we can keep that in mind, and remember that often those kinds of negative interactions that we might have are so often really not about us, or not even about what's being said, even if it feels like it's about us or it feels really personal. I think it's a really good reminder to that so much of the time it's not really about us, or that anger that's behind something, or that discomfort or that anxiety that might be occurring might really have nothing to do with us or that situation, and might have a whole lens of other information behind it. And I mentioned before to use person-centered language. This is really terminology that we use for really being attentive and specific about the type of language words that we use, how we, trying not to use kind of big words and jargon that can be really unnecessary to use. Really thinking about really vocabulary can reinforce feelings and beliefs. It helps guide behavior, right? All of these things that, we want to make sure that vocabulary is more than just a set of words. It's really tools that we can use to promote resilience. So we help others identify resilient behavior when we sort of use vocabulary to reinforce those feelings and beliefs. So when we kind of think about again, reducing the use of jargon, reducing the use of labels, things like words like manipulative or naughty or lazy, non-compliant, right? Those are some of the words that we really do want to stop using to describe people, residents, staff, and recognize that people are doing the best that they can with what they have. And that when we use language like that, we are automatically doing ourselves and others a disservice in sort of those interactions that we might have, and sort of what kind of stage we're setting up when we use language like that. So, such language such as that can really separate us. It dehumanizes those that we work with. And we really want to encourage sort of that need to approach everyone through mutual respect and compassion, rather than using, these words that I mentioned, sort of, which we know are not respectful and certainly minimize the strengths that we all possess. Another good technique that we can be using is really active listening. And this is, the approach, to really listening first and then speaking after. Too often we listen to respond and not listen to understand. We're like already thinking about what we're going to say as somebody else is talking, and like we're caught up in what we're going to prepare to come out, that we're not taking in fully what's being shared. So truly, in order to be trauma informed and resilient oriented, we need to practice listening to understand, to be present, to be engaged and truly curious, to know the other person and what they are trying to communicate. So we can do this when we're engaged in active listening, which is, again, listening to understand and listening through curiosity. So, we can do this, sort of the step one to this is reflective listening. So the first step to active listening is reflective listening. We cannot respond until we fully understand what is being shared. So we start by first listening to what the speaker is trying to convey. And it might, it looks like we hear what's being said. We try not to immediately respond, but if we can, paraphrase what we hear, or which, so saying and repeating it back in our own words. Sometimes we can add or infer a little bit more. Sometimes it's even reflective listening can even just be kind of restating using this exact same words that somebody used. So we can do it sort of in three levels, right? Sort of verbatim, using language that the person directly used and restating back to them some of what they said. We can paraphrase using our own language, something that they shared, or we can kind of take it a step further, paraphrase and infer more information, maybe from what we observed or some other information that we've learned. So we want to kind of verify what we heard first before then moving on to responding. And then we can respond, once we've sort of verified, and, and this is really not sharing opinion if it wasn't asked for, right? Like, so when we step in with answers and opinions that were not asked for, we kind of hijack the conversation away from that first speaker. And we send the message that we don't care about the first speaker, even if we're not, intending for that to happen. It does, infer that to some extent. So we don't want to send that message that, we just only want to talk about ourselves, which really shuts down any relationship. We want to engage in meaningful relationships and validate the speaker. So we stay curious and open to learning more about what they shared in reflective listening. So it's being attentive. It's about asking open-ended questions, right? Questions, close-ended questions are questions where people respond with like a 1 or 2 word answer, very short, very succinct answers. Whereas if you ask an open-ended question, then you're going to give an open-ended answer. You're going to elaborate. You're going to say something a little bit more. That's usually the tell me in what way, the how, the why. When you ask somebody to kind of explain, right? It allows for more elaboration. We want to ask probing questions. We want to show that we care, we're inquisitive, we want to learn and understand. It's sort of with that lens, like I said, of having cultural humility. Tell me, explain to me a little bit more, help me to understand. I also call it like wearing your Curious George hat, like, be inquisitive, request clarification, again, continue to paraphrase, be attuned to and reflect any feelings that you might hear. So that means, again, reflecting, right? Kind of paraphrasing back or restating back if there's any sort of feelings that are expressed by the speaker, and using summarization can also be helpful. So all of these kind of go into this active listening style, which is, again, something that we can do when we're interacting with others who have been triggered, who are that, whether we know or do not know, if they're experiencing trauma, we can kind of, this is really just a good approach to how we can interact with others. Ultimately, we're trying to also help people sort of reduce stress, right? The stress that's caused by all of these things that we're talking about, trauma and adverse experiences. So, sometimes, we need different kinds of techniques in order to manage the stress that we've experienced, whether that stress is from trauma or otherwise. So, we know when I talked about sort of stress impacting the lower brain level, and that the lower brain needs to assess safety in order to move on to the middle and then higher sort of prefrontal cortex area of our brain. What we have learned is there are some certain behaviors and things that we can do that really help regulate or calm the lower brain. Those include things like rhythmic, repetitive, relational, relevant, rewarding, and respectful activities. We can do things that might be relational, like they're safe and stable, connected to other people. They can be relevant, so developmentally matched to the individual. Repetitive, this is like pattern behavior, things like bouncing a ball, or something that's rewarding that we see as pleasurable or even masterful. Rhythmic, so again, resonant with like neural patterns, so things like drumming and playing basketball. Certainly respectful, it has to do, respectful of the child, the adult, the family, the culture. All of these things really help us to build resilience. And I know we're here sort of at sort of the full hour, and I have probably about 15 more minutes to go, just as a time check for people. Certainly, I will share slides for those of you who asked them if you do need to go, but wanted to kind of give you a time check here for the rest of the content that I have to share with you. And thank you. Keep the comments and the questions coming as you have been. So thank you for that. So resilience, resilience is essentially our ability to adapt when faced with adversity and significant amounts of stress, and then to return to an equilibrium, or find an equilibrium, or find a baseline. And what's amazing is that everyone has resilience, and everyone has the capacity to grow and build their resilience. So it's really about skills and really thinking about what can we do to really tap in, right, and help ourselves, help others to become resilient. And this also leans into just this idea of recovery and having a recovery framework. And when sometimes people hear the term recovery, they sometimes think of like recovering from an ailment, physical condition, or recovery in the sense of substance use. But really, recovery, in the sense that I'm using it, is really to mean that we're pursuing a fulfilling life, regardless of the difficulties one has faced. And it can involve the development of or continued enhancement of a positive identity, as well as personally meaningful connections in one's community. And it can be facilitated by meaningful relationships and environments that promote hope, empowerment, choices, and opportunities that support people in reaching their full potential as individuals and as community members. And so, if we're going to kind of build that resilience and have a framework for enhancing that recovery opportunity for people, we want to think about how we infuse trauma-informed care in our daily work by promoting resilience, right? So this process of adapting well in the face of adversity, the face of trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. So there's all sorts of ways, like you see here on the screen, of being able to, being able to enhance people's ability to handle and manage the stress in their lives by being resilient. Things like emotional regulation, which is our ability to control our emotions and our attention and our behavior, or impulse control, right? The ability to manage the expression of our feelings, and so on. So really thinking about sort of all of these kinds of areas, empathy, which is the ability to read others' behavior, to understand their states, to build relationships, and to build the relationships, and also reaching out, right? The continued drive to take on more challenges, more opportunities. We want to kind of think about how we cope, how we survive, adjust to new conditions. So, we can, when you think about as managers, and you're working with your staff, you want to obviously encourage resilience among your staff, among your employees, in addition to among yourselves, being able to, it's not just about having a thick skin and putting up with stuff. It is also about having different skills and abilities to manage oneself through the day-to-day, and really to figure out how you can use resources better, how you can feel supported in the work, that your voice matters, that you have voice and choice. And it helps really lean into counteracting burnout and compassion fatigue. And, burnout is a term that we use to refer to sort of general exhaustion and lack of interest or motivation regarding one's work. Compassion fatigue, sometimes it's called vicarious trauma. This really refers to negative emotions that we might feel from helping others at work, right? So when you think about helping residents, who might have a lot of stressors, a lot of problems, maybe their own experiences, and you're sort of taking that in, you kind of take in a sort of a level of those sort of emotional effects of what they've experienced. And either way, whether it's burnout or compassion fatigue, both things are not permanent. There's an ebb and flow in which they might happen. They will happen more often, burnout or compassion fatigue, if we are not caring for ourselves, building up our resiliency skills, and figuring out better ways of handling ourselves. So we have to be on the lookout for this, and have to be thinking about, what do we do to help ourselves, help our staff, and ultimately also how do we help our residents that we work with? In thinking about this. And I have the image here of sort of the glass of water. And I do like to think about this sort of, an analogy of, like, we are like a filled glass of water, right? And if we are constantly, when it comes to compassion fatigue, especially, if we're constantly sort of pouring out and giving our water to others out of our cup, and we're never doing things to refill our own cup of water, we're eventually going to get depleted. And there's always opportunities to refill. Again, if we're watching and paying attention to this, same kind of goes with burnout. Like, if we're constantly watching and looking out for burnout and compassion fatigue and doing things to offset it, we can keep filling up that glass, our own personal glass. But if we don't pay attention, if we're not monitoring it, if we're not doing things to help ourselves, we do get depleted, and then we're of no use to ourselves or anyone else. And it's sort of that same rationale, if you've ever flown in a plane and they say, put your oxygen mask on you first and then help the ones around you. Well, you're not going to be good to anyone around you if you're passed out because you never put the oxygen mask on. You need to help yourself first, which is an okay thing to do, in order to then be there to help others. It's sort of that same kind of process. So, we can build protective factors for ourselves. We can do things to improve our environment. We can do things to improve our support system, right? Thinking about eating, exercise, creating good boundaries. And I'm going to talk about some of these things. Ultimately, I invite all of you to kind of think on your own for yourself. Think about those you work with, about how do you help, and think about how you build out some of these protective factors, and how do you create your own self-care plan. And whether that's a formal written plan that you put out, or whether you kind of just think of it in your head. There's many different ways to kind of create that, but it's really kind of thinking through all of these kind of things that you see here on the screen, right? Understanding what are the kinds of boundaries do you keep? Are you somebody who's like working 24/7? Like you're working in your sleep, you dream about work, you get up and you work, you do work while you're in your personal life, right? How do you keep those work boundaries versus your personal life? When do you say yes too much? Do you say no too much? How do you think about just this is not just physical boundaries that you keep with people, but sort of the sort of rules and guides that you kind of operate by in your day to day. So really kind of thinking about, is there space to enhance that at all, and to create healthier boundaries, sort of when work starts and stops, or when you maybe kind of take phone calls from residents or whatever it may be. Think about boundaries and seeing what adjustments might need to be made. This is also about improved nutrition. We have all sorts of opportunities to kind of think about the way in which we eat, and how the food that we put in our body, how it makes us feel, sometimes good in the moment and then not so good later, right? So really just thinking about that, and thinking about how we might need to shift what we eat. If I were to ask people, like, do you take a lunch? Do you step away from your desk when you take a lunch? Like, are there things too, again, kind of that overlap with boundaries and nutrition, as far as what we can do to care for ourselves? Caring for ourselves and figuring out how to enhance our resiliency might also be about creating movement, or and we don't have to be sweating to the oldies with Richard Simmons, which I'm dating myself here putting this on the slide, but you're just really thinking about the way that you get up and move around in your day. Like, do you stand and stretch? Do you take a walk? Like, all of these things kind of can help us manage, again, that stress, that day to day, and help alleviate the effects of trauma. But I want us to think about even bigger than trauma, right? Is that managing of stress, and what we can do for ourselves on a day to day. It's kind of like Nickelodeon green slime. It's like a pile of green slime building up. And if we don't do things to kind of take it out, where it's going to eventually ooze out in ways that we don't want it to ooze out, those sort of negative effects. So we have to find things to offset it. Sleep is another big thing to take a look at. Are you getting on average 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night? Do you have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, or do you sleep too much? What do you do for your sleep hygiene, or the process for when you're getting ready to go to sleep at night? Do you use your phone up until the moment that you kind of pass out with it on your face, or do you put it away and shut off that blue light in advance of going into your bed? Do you fall asleep with the radio or the TV on, and that noise and the light? Our bodies are actually feeling that and sensing that even when we're not aware of it. Or do you set maybe a sleep timer so it eventually shuts off so your body can go into a deeper sleep? All those kinds of things. I'm thinking about the ways that we self-soothe, tactile sensations, weighted blankets, fidget spinners, fidget poppers. They're not just for kids, they're good for us too. And those tactile things that we can do, things that we can taste, right? Engaging all of the senses. There's all sorts of things that we can do in different kinds of visualizations or meditations that kind of tap into this. We can sometimes call them grounding exercises. And here are some examples of those. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 game is kind of saying to yourself, what are again, engaging the senses. What are 5 things you can see in the room, 4 things you can feel in the room, 3 things that you can hear right now, 2 things that you can smell right now, or that you like the smell of, and name 1 good thing about yourself. Additionally, there are also so many other stress reduction interventions, things like deep breathing. We started today with a mindfulness technique that incorporated some breathing. Visualization or guided imagery, again, is where we sort of imagine being in a different space or place involving the different senses. Progressive muscle relaxation might be is the tightening and then releasing of our muscle groups, either all at once or in succession, in how that can actually help release release the tension in the body. And there's so many other everyday ways to relax, right? Lighting candles, taking a bath, exercising at the gym, watching some TV, doing a crossword puzzle, taking a yoga class, cuddling, like there's listening to music. There's so many things that we can do that cost little or no money that we need to figure out how to bake in to, again, help address burnout, compassion fatigue, and help to really take a break for our spirit. And really, so I do want to, again, encourage you all as you leave here today to ask yourself, when did you feel most alive or like yourself? What were the things that you were doing? Were they pleasurable? Were they masterful? Did they give you a sense of accomplishment or achievement? What are you doing to achieve those things now? Who are you surrounded with when you're feeling those positive things? And what can you do differently as you move forward? So thank you so much for staying with me as I moved a little bit beyond the hour to impart this information to you. I really appreciate the time and dedication. My contact information is here with my email address. And thank you so much. I'm going to move on to just check the chat and the Q&A. I think many of you did ask for the slides, so I'll be happy to send those to you, but happy to entertain any questions that you might have or any comments. Feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A.
Again, thank you, Laura. This is wonderful. And also, to reiterate, feel free to post your questions in either the chat or the Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen. We'll read them aloud. We'll answer them aloud. You're going to be busy emailing slides, Laura, that's for sure.
That is true, but that's okay. I'm happy to do that.
Wonderful. And I will send you the chat, save chat later, and I will send you the question later, so you'll have the full record. But we have one question, which is great. How do we best engage trauma-informed care when working with an actively angry resident?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's a few different things. So part of trauma-informed care and an approach is again, sort of the understanding and the knowledge that we bring in the situation, that we have to remember. Often it's not about us. Often it's not personal, even when we feel like we're being personally attacked, and having sort of that frame of mind when we're interacting. It's also using some of those de-escalation techniques. And if you go back, when you look at the slides later, or look at this recording later, you can kind of go back and look at those different techniques about staying calm, keeping a low voice, being able to try to listen to what the person is saying and help that person know that you're listening by doing some reflective listening, which is, again, reflecting back to them in statements what you heard that person say or share, and to really, again, try to kind of weed through the anger that's happening, in part that you're really there to try to help them or to work with them as best you can. Those are some of the approaches, and then there were others too that you can touch upon. And I see another question here about, are there ways to, would I recommend that companies develop programs to proactively combat compassion fatigue? Yes. It's like a leading question right there. I do think that, anyone in any work that we do has the opportunity to experience burnout. And often the effects of burnout are similar to the effects of compassion fatigue. So if you're working where you work with others in any capacity, there's that ability to kind of pull in again and be affected by sort of the stress in the effort that we might put into helping others. There's a lot of energy that goes through that. So if we can combat that, if we can help people manage that, and do that while kind of replenishing their own reserves, we can help them do it for longer. We can help sort of build that resilience and that capacity for managing it and for doing it. People are always going to need help, right? And they're always going to be helpers to help others. Those things will always exist. What we can do is to sort of build those resources, internal and otherwise, to really help do that in a successful way.
Well, perhaps one more question, Laura. What are some of the techniques you have used in a very uncomfortable time?
What are the techniques I've used in an uncomfortable time? I guess if we mean, if it's like an uncomfortable conversation or situation, it's kind of a vague response. So I'll kind of take with it or vague question. So I'll take with it what I think you mean. There are certain times where I might have to have like an uncomfortable conversation with somebody, let's say about their hygiene, or maybe the way that they're keeping themselves or their environment. I just think about the potential conversations that you might have with residents or other people around like their work habits or around their living habits. And that can be uncomfortable or difficult. And again, I always try to be as authentic and genuine when I am approaching somebody and trying to put myself in their shoes and acknowledge as best I can how they're feeling or what they might be thinking, and recognizing somebody's strengths and abilities by verbally saying so in the conversation. Again, not just sort of guessing or saying something without sort of anything to back it up, because people know that they can sense if you're disingenuous. So being careful not to do that, but as best you can to do that, while also just clearly as you can being upfront with the content that you have to share. We don't have to be aggressive in the kinds of language that we use or what we say in order to get a point across. We don't get our points across so if we're too passive or timid also. So there is a fine line and a balance with figuring out how do you speak up and be assertive while being kind in the way that you do so. And for me, those are some sort of rules that I operate by whenever I'm in sort of an uncomfortable conversation or situation. Again, just one example of probably many that you're looking for, but I hope that helps.
No, that's great. Well, listen, for further questions, Laura was gracious enough to post her email on the slide number 52. So feel free to email her directly. Next slide, please, Laura.
Sure.
Well, again, I want to thank Laura for this outstanding webinar. And for additional resources, NAA maintains an online portal for its many offerings and operations solutions for the rental housing industry. The URL is featured below. I especially wish to highlight, next slide, please. I especially wish to highlight the remainder of NAA's Mental Health Awareness Week. We're continuing to partner with the National Council to present this series of webinars addressing mental health issues felt keenly within the rental housing industry. Additional topics include mitigating employee burnout, that's tomorrow, and coping strategies for on-site staff, that's Thursday. So make sure to register today. Next slide, please. Finally, if you've enjoyed today's webinar and would like to view more, you can always visit our YouTube channel for those many NAA webinars that are now viewable on demand. The URL is featured below. Last slide, please. Again, I wish to thank everyone for participating. I wish to thank Laura and her colleagues at the National Council. This is a tremendous resource. We're grateful for your expertise. Of course, we value our audience. We value your membership and appreciate your attendance. So all, have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
All right. Here it is.